Welcome, everybody. This is Jeff Fowler with the Apartment Owners Association. It's great to have you with us today. Today, we're going to be talking about 7 different benefits of estate planning benefits of 1031 DST investments. And if this is your first time with us today, you're probably watching from AOAUSA.com. You're probably a new member. And just want to let you know that this is being recorded on YouTube. And after the fact, you can go to YouTube and watch it. There's a little YouTube icon on the AOAUSA.com website. And if you click on that, it'll take you directly to the AOA USA channel on YouTube. And there's a video for maximizing your membership. So just type in the word membership there and that'll come up and you can watch that. So it's great to have you with us. And for those of you that have been around for a while, if you haven't really used much of your membership, then that might be a good video for you as well. We had a crash course, a tenant screening crash course, a move in, move out crash course that we did just recently in the last month or so. So those might be videos to check out just as, as a lot of you are going through that process right now, being the time of year that it is. And, we're trying to bring you information that's going to help you make and or keep more money than ever before. And another one that we did was paint, flooring, lines, like what's the best types to use, what are the tricks to saving money on that, and getting a good product, not just saving money, but getting something that's going to last and be a great investment instead of guessing on that. So the size of how thick should that flooring be, all those different things, they cover that. And I hope that that's a good resource for you as well. All right. And then on June 26th, we have a couple different live streams coming up. One is maximum allowable rent increases for Southern California. And we're going to be releasing a video for Northern California. So that one's not live, but we're going to release that soon. So, and that happens sometimes where we just release things. So if you toggle over the notification button after you subscribe, then it's a little bit easier to, you'll find those videos and not miss them. And anyway, and then also unlawful detainer process in the city of LA is another live stream that we're going to be having on the 26th. So that'll be a double header that day. And of course, you can catch it after the fact as well. And the only in-person event that we have coming up right now is going to be in August. We know a lot of you travel right now, so we don't do seminars during the summer. But August 20th, we will have the free AOA $1 Million Trade Show at the Long Beach Convention Center. And it's really shaping up. We have a good lineup of speakers. We have an expert coming to talk about midterm rentals, and that's corporate leasing. And I think that could be real valuable for some of you, where you could really increase your income and maybe reduce some of the tenant drama with a midterm rental, that idea. And so we're always trying to come with ideas and resources for you. Anyway, if you are watching from AOAUSA.com, there is that blue help button at the bottom, and you can type a question in there, and they will get that over to me, and we can ask the question live. And of course, YouTube, Facebook, you're able to put in a comment, and we're monitoring there, and we can get to it. And I just wanted to thank Real Estate Transition Solutions for sponsoring this event. They're a real estate advisory firm, and really they specialize in DSTs. They have 4 different offices on the West Coast, including Orange County and San Francisco. And I believe they do about 220 million yearly in replacement property. And so they are really doing a tremendous job and have helped a lot of the AOA members. And so our speaker today is a partner and chief exchange strategist at Real Estate Transition Solutions. He's a CPA with extensive expertise in 1031 exchange strategies and other tax deferral strategies. He leads Real Estate Transition Solutions team of skilled advisors and analysts, serving as both an advisor and advocate for owners of highly appreciated real estate, which is many of you. So congratulations, you made the right choice in investing in real estate. And so here you are today. And our speaker, he regularly contributes to educational articles and highly acclaimed publications like Business Insider and even in the AOA magazine. And so he's got a lot of knowledge and insight in this field. So I'm excited to have Austin Bowlin join us today. So, hey, Austin, how are you?
Jeff, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me today.
Great. Well,
All right, wonderful. Well, Jeff, I appreciate the introduction and thank you to AOA for all the hard work you do, both from an advocacy standpoint and a property owner resources standpoint. As Jeff mentioned, today we are going to be discussing estate planning benefits of Delaware statutory trust replacement property, which is a increasingly popular 1031 exchange replacement property option. One item to note, the Delaware statutory trusts as replacement property for 1031 exchange purposes are also treated as registered securities with the SEC and as specifically what are referred to as Regulation D securities. There is a requirement that in order to exchange or invest into Delaware statutory trusts, one be what is considered an accredited investor. Typically, an investor is accredited by virtue of having a net worth in excess of $1 million. Alternatively, you can be accredited by meeting various income thresholds or by holding a number of professional licenses or certifications. But do know that accreditation is a requirement in order to exchange into Delaware statutory trusts. What you see here is an overview of what we plan to discuss today. I'll give a brief recap of our firm and the work that we do. Then take a quick lap through 1031 exchange fundamentals, just to make sure everyone has that foundational knowledge. And then we'll talk about the crossover between owning investment real estate and estate planning implications. Some of the challenges that are often encountered when looking at transitioning real estate to beneficiaries from an estate standpoint. Then we'll talk about how the Delaware statutory trust can alleviate a lot of those challenges and different techniques and approaches that can be utilized. And lastly, we'll walk through some additional educational resources available to the AOA community and make sure to save time for questions as well. Our firm, Real Estate Transition Solutions, or RETS as we're commonly known, as Jeff mentioned, is a real estate advisory firm that really focuses on serving property owners who find themselves in the third and the fourth quarter of life. So typically retirement age, own real estate that's appreciated significantly in value, such that if they were to just outright sell the property, they would face significant tax consequences. And what we know is that real estate ownership's very dynamic. Physical properties change, maintenance projects come up, capital improvements, etc. Market conditions change, the interest rate environment changes, the regulatory environment changes at a faster rate than any of us would really like. And on top of all of that, owners' objectives change as they go through the various chapters of life. A younger owner may be very comfortable with a return profile that is weighted primarily or exclusively toward appreciation. Whereas as they enter more traditional retirement years, perhaps they want a more balanced blend between cash flow and appreciation. Or an owner may find themselves after years or decades of ownership being fairly concentrated in one particular property type in one particular geographic location, i.e., purchasing single-family homes or multifamily properties within a commutable distance of where one lives, which is a great way to build one's overall portfolio. But at a certain point, that concentration presents risk as you look at preservation of capital down the road. And estate planning, that's often not front of mind for younger property owners when they're starting their investment property journey, if you will. But as they get up into their 60s, 70s, 80s, I'm thinking about how can one seamlessly transition their assets to a surviving spouse, to beneficiaries, and do so in a tax efficient manner, often will increase in terms of where it falls on one's order of priorities and objectives. So the work our firm does is to come alongside property owners, help them to analyze the properties that they currently own, discuss and determine their objectives, both from a financial and a lifestyle standpoint. And should there be a gap between one's currently owned investment real estate and their objectives, then develop an intentional and cohesive transition strategy that will be as tax efficient as possible so that you can reposition your investment real estate into properties that will then ultimately serve your objectives. We perform a number of 1031 exchanges with our clients, about 150 exchanges a year, and work extensively with the Delaware Statutory Trust replacement property option. Delaware statutory trusts were approved by the IRS as exchange eligible back in 2004. As it stands today, the information you see here on this slide is as of year-end 2024, but as it stands today, we have about $1.4 billion of DST real estate under advisement and have completed well over 800 1031 exchanges with our clients, and have been working to make sure that these properties are going to ultimately be suitable and a fit for our exchangers. From a due diligence standpoint, I'm proud to say we've only ever had one property have less than a full return of principal for our clients that we work with. You see a quick snapshot of some of the key members of our leadership team and our advisor team. We are headquartered up in Seattle, Washington, Kirkland specifically, if you're familiar with the Puget Sound area, but have offices in Portland, San Francisco, and Orange County as well. So with that background on our firm, the 1031 exchange is a transaction that's made allowable by Section 1031 in the tax code. And it's arguably one of the strongest or most powerful sections of the tax code, because what it allows for is owners of investment real estate to sell property and then defer all of the tax that would otherwise be due upon that sale by purchasing replacement property within a defined timeline. As California property owners, we can be looking at as high as a 42.1% tax rate applicable on the sale of a property, which is a massive haircut when one is selling a property and not performing a 1031 exchange. And on top of that, there's a lot of flexibility as it relates to replacement property options within a 1031 exchange. You'll hear a term often used in exchanges, which is like kind. Like kind in the eyes of the IRS means the intent as to why the property is owned on that which is sold and that which is purchased needs to be the same. And all property held for business or investment purposes, regardless of the property type and regardless of the location, provided it is domestic property located within the United States, is like kind with one another. From exchange benefit standpoint, many property owners whom we work with will exchange into replacement property because they are trying to address and seeking to address objectives like those you see here on this slide. They're wanting to have higher cash flow. They're wanting to have more tax sheltering from their replacement property so that less of the income that they're earning is going to be subject not only to federal income tax, but state income tax. They're wanting to diversify their asset base. They're wanting to invest in markets where they see a more balanced regulatory environment, stronger demographic trends like migration of people, diversified employer bases, and also, and this is the topic of today's presentation, because they want to stage their property to be more conducive for a seamless estate transfer. From a replacement property ownership structure standpoint, there's really three broad categories that one can exchange into that are exchange eligible. Going right to left here, there's fee simple property ownership. This is how most of you likely own your property today, either held directly in your own name or in a single member LLC, closely held ownership group, or in a revocable living trust. The common theme within fee simple property ownership is the owners themselves have all of the management responsibility associated with those properties. Then over on the left side of the slide, there are two fractional ownership structures available. where one can exchange into owning a portion of large institutional quality properties. There's the Delaware Statutory Trust, which typically focuses on newer construction, fully stabilized properties. And then there's the tenant in common structure. Here we'll see more active value add strategies, more focus on, say, repurposing a property or doing something unique with that property, and arguably a little bit higher risk profile depending on what that investment strategy is. Real estate presents a number of benefits from an estate standpoint, but it also presents some challenges that are worth recognizing. First and foremost, when passing property to beneficiaries, depending on the state of residency of the individual, depending on the location of the properties themselves, it can end up triggering tax consequences. Now, what we know is that owning appreciated real estate is eligible for what's called a step up in basis, which means that all of the tax that's been accumulated over years of appreciation and years of depreciation is then eliminated for a surviving spouse upon the passing of a first spouse in a community property state like California, and then eliminated again for any additional tax that accrues when it is ultimately passed down to beneficiaries. The reason that step up in basis is made available through the tax code is because then the present value, the fair market value of one's estate as a whole, can in turn be subject to estate tax. Now, estate tax at the federal level can be as high as 40%, but there's also a very high exemption amount. Currently, that sits at around $27 million for a married couple. So if you have a estate that is sitting underneath that exemption amount, and given the fact that California as it stands today does not have a state level estate tax, then likely you're not going to trigger any estate tax consequences. However, there can be scenarios where if you're over $27 million from an overall estate standpoint, then when you transition those assets to beneficiaries, it would trigger those estate tax implications. And sometimes, unfortunately, assets have to be sold in order to cover that tax liability. One of the most common challenges, though, is how one can distribute assets among beneficiaries. So now we're talking about moving to, say, that next generation. Commonly, this is adult children. Without forcing them into a co-ownership, co-management situation. It's very common to see a scenario where, let's say, a property owner has 3 children and 2 multifamily properties, 2 10-unit apartment buildings, for instance. Well, unless there is a significant amount of liquidity or other assets within the estate that can be used to make the transition of those assets to the beneficiaries equitable, likely what's going to end up happening, excuse me, is that one would need to give a portion of ownership of each of those properties to each of the children. And now we have a co-ownership, co-management situation. We've been on the unfortunate side of seeing many siblings that are adults at this point, but would very much get along with one another if they did not have to make major financial decisions together. Inevitably, one sibling takes lead on management, then eventually some of their decisions will be questioned by siblings. They're often not adequately compensated for the time that they put into managing the property. And it can be a scenario that is ripe for breeding resentment and creating a divide among adult siblings. So co-ownership, co-management can be a very complex situation to navigate. And it's very much on that first generation to stage the estate in a way that's not going to ultimately create a divide among their children. Additionally, it's very common within, say, a married couple to have one of those spouses take lead on the management and the operations of those properties. And if they were to pass away, what could end up occurring is you will have a surviving spouse who's, call it, much less equipped and much less familiar with property ownership and property management to then have to make decisions about these properties. And that could even entail unwinding, navigating the sale process of those properties. But it's not as simple as engaging a broker and then saying we're just going to list the properties and sell them for whatever the market says they're worth. There's a broker selection process. There is capital improvements that likely need to be made to properties in order to stage properties for sale and the like. So if you want to prevent forcing and burdening a surviving spouse or adult children who may have very little experience with investment real estate to unwind the portfolio, then again, you can stage your overall real estate portfolio appropriately beforehand to alleviate that. There are also differences between state laws. Sometimes this surfaces because a beneficiary, say adult child, may live in a different state that has an inheritance tax associated with it. Or we could be looking at changes that would occur at the California state level that would end up ultimately triggering tax consequences. There's complexity here that one needs to be aware of and cognizant of as well when transitioning assets to beneficiaries. So how does the Delaware Statutory Trust address many of these issues? Well, first, Delaware Statutory Trust, like all direct real estate ownership, is eligible for 1031 exchange, or excuse me, eligible for that step up in basis. What you see here is on the right side of this slide is a quick snapshot of this concept. If an owner acquires a property for, let's say, $500,000, and then passes away with that property now valued at $1.5 million, there would typically be $1 million of capital gain embedded inside of that property. But that capital gain is wiped away, eliminated by way of the step up in basis. So there's very much a strong value proposition for continuing to own real estate broadly that has deferred tax liability inside of it until that step up in basis is realized. And Delaware Statutory Trust, just like any properties you may own today, are very much eligible for that step up in basis. When we talk about how to divide one's assets up among beneficiaries, there's a lot of flexibility as it relates to using Delaware statutory trusts. Given the fact that DSTs are already an ownership structure that allow for fractional ownership of large institutional quality properties, you could specifically identify individual DSTs to go to each beneficiary, or you could take all of your DST ownership. Say you sold a 10-unit apartment building for $3 million or $2.5 million and exchanged into 4 or 5 different DST properties. You could divide each of those properties up equitably among your beneficiaries so that they each have a piece of that overall DST portfolio. Again, all of those DSTs would realize that step up in basis. Every beneficiary would have the exact same portfolio, just smaller allocations to that portfolio. So you can blend these strategies together. If you have, say, stepchildren, then that's a way in which perhaps you're not planning on giving the same amount to them as you are your blood children. However you decide to approach this, there's complete flexibility here because it's already fractional ownership with, importantly, zero management responsibility. So now those beneficiaries are not going to need to make decisions together. Instead, they're going to benefit from the return on that investment. And when that property ultimately sells, which is typically 5 to 7 years down the road, then they can go their own separate directions with those proceeds with little to no tax consequences. This is an interesting concept that I think is often more complicated than people assume at first. But some property owners have a charitable bent to them, which is very commendable, and are looking at some of their investment real estate as a way to transition assets and do charitable giving to non-for-profits. However, gifting real estate to non-for-profits can present a good amount of complexity because that nonprofit is going to be very concerned about assuming liability. If a property has debt on it, for most nonprofits, that's a non-starter. They do not want to inherit any liabilities. And even if it does not have debt, commonly they'll go through a extensive and expensive assessment of that property to determine if there's any environmental issues, if there's any property condition issues, any outstanding litigation, and the like before accepting that property. And then once they do accept the property, then they will turn around and likely sell the property or whatever they can get at that moment, which is typically not going to result in a liquidity event that would end up realizing all of the potential of that property. Additionally, non-for-profits are not going to feel comfortable co-owning a property with multiple other nonprofits. So you really have to give each individual property to a standalone non-for-profit, which means you could be gifting to a non-for-profit more than you would want to any one individual nonprofit. The Delaware Statutory Trust very much addresses this consideration because what you can do is sell your property, in which case you are likely going to realize the highest potential sales proceeds given your familiarity with the property, exchange into owning fractional ownership of large institutional properties that the non-for-profits are going to feel very comfortable accepting. In fact, you can even use a particular subcategory of DSTs that we've spoken about in previous AOA webinars that are referred to as 721 UPREITs, where then the DST property is absorbed by a large real estate investment trust, in which case the ownership in the DST converts to shares in the REIT, which is liquid for the nonprofit, so that they can sell those shares when the time is right for them. When we talk about estate planning benefits, it's not exclusively the transition to the surviving spouse or to the next generation that needs to be considered, but it's also the financial planning concepts in those later years of life. And by performing a 1031 exchange, what you're doing is you're not taking the haircut of all the tax that would otherwise need to be paid. Again, eventually that tax will be eliminated through the step up in basis. So in those final 10, 15 years, if you keep all those dollars working for you, that's ultimately going to lead to more property ownership, more appreciation potential, and more income production along the way. And then lastly, if you find yourself in a scenario where you have a federal estate value that's over the federal estate exemption amount, or you reside in a state that does have a state level estate tax, then Delaware Statutory Trust can be used in order to reduce the value of your overall estate through what's called a discount for lack of control or marketability. So quick example here. Let's say you're an individual property owner with a $30 million estate. And of those $30 million in your overall estate, let's say 10 million of which is held in Delaware statutory trusts. There's a very defensible position, even though the fair market value is $10 million for those DSTs, to actually, for estate planning purposes, estate valuation purposes, consider that worth $8 or $7 million, a 20 to 30% discount, because it is a non-controlling interest in a larger property, which can then get you underneath or at least substantially mitigate your federally taxable portion of your overall estate. Again, that's referred to as a discount for lack of control or marketability. Another benefit that we have here is liquidity for beneficiaries. So with the traditional Delaware statutory trust structure, properties are held for 5 to 7 years and then sold, and that sale of the property is what creates a liquidity event. But going back to that 721 UPREIT structure I mentioned earlier, there's a subcategory of DSTs where the DST property is held for 2 years, a much shorter hold period. And then ownership in the DST converts into effectively shares of a large, typically diversified real estate investment trust. After a 1-year lockup period in the real estate investment trust, generally those shares become liquid, which means that if an owner is at an age where they're saying a 5 to 7 year hold period feels a little bit long, given life expectancy, they could utilize the 721 UPREIT structure And then upon that passing, after only a 3-year hold period, the beneficiaries would still be eligible for that step up in basis, but could sell shares immediately after that step up is realized. And as I mentioned earlier, looking at not just the actual transition to the beneficiaries themselves, but the years leading up to that date of passing, by keeping all of your proceeds working for you, that can meaningfully increase one's returns, generating higher cash flow in what are often more expensive years of life. As far as additional educational resources available, if you have specific estate planning questions or questions about 1031 exchanges in general, replacement property options, or would like to learn more about Delaware statutory trusts, we always make a complimentary consultation available to the AOA community. You can schedule a consultation by visiting our AOA hub page, which you see at the footer of this slide. It's re-transition.com/AOA, where we've taken all of our educational content and narrowed it down to what is most applicable for California property owners. Or you can call the number that you see at the bottom of this slide. We'd be happy to talk through the specifics of your situation or address any questions that you may have. If you're interested in seeing currently available or recently funded Delaware statutory trust properties that have made it through our firm's internal due diligence process, you can do so by visiting our DST marketplace. This marketplace will give you a feel for the size and quality and caliber of these properties, the locations of the properties, the property types, etc. So very helpful from an illustrative standpoint. Or we can take it one step further, and if you are willing to share your objectives and overall exchange scenario with us, then we can design a tailored illustrative portfolio for you to share and walk through with you. If you'd like to dive deeper into the Delaware statutory trust structure, another resource that is very helpful is our guide to investing in DSTs. And this is a 28-page guide available on our website for download. It's complimentary, it's a free guide. And they'll give you an overview of the history and the structure of Delaware statutory trust replacement property options and a number of exchange strategies available by leveraging DSTs. And then lastly, webinars are a near weekly occurrence here at RETS. What you can see here is 2 of our upcoming webinars. In just under a week, we'll be hosting our 1031 exchange fundamentals webinar. And then early part of July, we'll talk about exchange strategies and go through some illustrative case studies to leverage 1031 exchanges and maximize your returns. Well, Jeff, that's all I have on my end. Happy to field any questions that might have come in.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing. That was a really good presentation, and it's good to see. Yeah, definitely thought-provoking. And yeah, so we do have questions here. If you would like to put in a question, now would be a great time to do it before we wrap up. And if you are watching on AOAUSA.com, again, there's the blue help button, and you can type a question in there, and then Maria will get that over to me, and then we can ask it live here. And so, yeah, just to start off on YouTube, WT, how liquid are DST investments in California?
So there's 2 categories of DSTs. One way to categorize DSTs is by looking at the exit structure. There's the traditional DST structure where you exchange into a property or portfolio of properties. It's typically held 5 to 7 years, income producing throughout, cash flows distributed on a monthly basis. And then eventually that property is sold to a third party, another institutional buyer, whomever is willing to pay the most for the property, at which time then there's a liquidity event for the investors. And everyone gets to then make their own independent decision as to what they'd like to do with their proceeds, whether that's perform a subsequent 1031 exchange into another DST, or perhaps back into a fee simple property, or recognize their tax liability, or again, as I mentioned earlier, if a step up in basis is realized, then they could just receive their sales proceeds with little to no tax consequences. There's also the 721 UPREIT DST structure. Here we're talking about a 2-year hold period in the DST. Then that sponsor's REIT will absorb the property into their larger REIT portfolio. Typically, this is a $1 to $5 billion portfolio of institutional real estate, and the ownership in the DST then converts into effectively shares in the REIT. Technically, they're called operating partnership units, but they behave the exact same way as the REIT shares. Once in the REIT, so now we're talking 2 years post sale and exchange, there's typically a 1-year lockup period, and then liquidity is available for all of the REIT owners, all the exchangers who came in. And so you could sell shares as you please from that moment forward. If looking at the traditional DST structure from a liquidity standpoint, you're likely going to be best served holding that investment until the property ultimately sells. However, there are some circumstances, such as someone passing away and a step up in basis being realized, or should someone need funds for some reason, medical expenditures, whatever it might be, where someone will sell their DST ownership early. And there is a mechanism to do so. It requires a private party transaction, and is one of the benefits of working with a large firm like ours that will typically have 25 to 35 exchanges open at any given point, because we can then make that ownership available to new exchangers. And if there's interest in purchasing it, then we'll connect the two together and they can agree upon pricing, and then we can facilitate that transaction.
Great. Now you mentioned step up in basis, and one of the questions here by Grace is just if you could explain what that is. Sometimes step up sounds like more, like more tax. So could you explain that one for us?
So it's the exact opposite of that. It's actually the elimination of all of the deferred tax liability. And what happens with investment real estate is if you purchase a property for X amount, let's say you acquire a property for 500,000, over time, you're going to realize depreciation on an annual basis. If say you recognize $20,000 of depreciation per year, that's a tax concept. The depreciation is effectively there to capture, we'll call it obsolescence of the property over a certain period of time. And you get a write-off every year for that $20,000 of depreciation. However, eventually, when that property is sold, if an exchange is not performed, then you pay tax on the total of the depreciation you've taken over the period of ownership. That's what's referred to as accumulated depreciation. And you pay tax at a tax rate of 25% at the federal level, plus California state income tax, plus likely a 3.8% net investment income tax as well. So it can be a substantial tax. That's where we can get to a 42.1% tax liability. 25% plus 13.3% plus 3.8%. Additionally, if that property was purchased for 500,000 and now has appreciated in value, increased in value to, let's say, $1.5 million over the 10, 20, 25 years of ownership, now we have capital gain tax. And that capital gain tax is 20% at the federal level, plus California state income tax, plus 3.8% net investment income tax. So you have two, we'll call it buckets of dollars, if you will, of the sales proceeds that will have two different tax rates applied to them. And if someone passes away with that embedded tax liability inside the property, what happens is the remaining basis in the property, which was your original purchase price, plus any capital improvements, less the accumulated depreciation, that remaining basis moves all the way up. It steps up to fair market value at the date of passing. And then if that property were sold immediately after a step up in basis was realized, so someone's passed away, let's say a surviving spouse now owns the property, and the fair market value of the property is $1.5 million. If they sold it as right after that step up in basis was realized, they would have no tax consequences associated with that sale. Now, likely, that surviving spouse is going to live for a number of years more. Let's say they live for another 5, 10 years. There would be more depreciation taken. Hopefully, that property appreciates in value additionally as well. And then there's a second step up in basis to fair market value when that property then transitions down to the next generation, when the beneficiaries inherit the property. So that's the concept of the step up in basis. It's moving the remaining basis all the way up to fair market value whenever there is a passing that occurs.
Great. And Alan is asking if the return cash flow is a capital gain or not. And so it's not a capital gain, but he's asking what is the typical cash flow return?
For DSTs specifically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In today's environment, if we're going to design a diversified portfolio of DST properties, so maybe there's some multifamily, some industrial, some senior housing, maybe some medical office in that portfolio, we're typically looking at right around 5% starting first year cash flow. And that income should grow year over year. And then there is also appreciation that would be realized upon the eventual sale of the property. The income itself, the monthly cash flow that investors receive, is not taxed as a capital gain. It's taxed at ordinary income tax rates, whatever that is for the individual. But additionally, not all of that income will be taxable because, again, you benefit from depreciation and the qualified business income deduction to shelter perhaps all, but usually a meaningful portion of that cash flow from being subject to tax.
And just avoiding tax is a massive deal.
Absolutely. I mean, it's
That's
guaranteed
a,
return.
yeah. All right. And then Wilfred here has what is the minimum amount to get a DST?
Typically, most DST properties of the traditional structure will have a $100,000 minimum investment amount if you are performing a 1031 exchange. There are a handful of properties that will have a $250,000 minimum investment. Most of the 721 UPREIT properties have a $250,000 minimum investment.
Great. And just to circle back to the first question, how liquid is the DST? Just thinking, how liquid is any real estate? So like selling your property is that's obviously not liquid. Oh gosh. Oh yeah. So this is the point. Yeah, this is the question I'll pose just so that they could also understand. Are
Mhm.
you able to do a partial exchange?
Absolutely. You definitely can. Yep. And we work with a number of exchangers that will do that where they're selling a property and they'd like to have $100,000 or $200,000 of liquidity come out of the transaction. In some scenarios, we'll advise them to do that depending on their current liquidity position and their age and the like, other assets that they have. Those funds that you pay tax on, that you take out of the transaction, they would be taxable. So it's important to understand the implications of that. And it's common that there are other less expensive sources of liquidity that one may have available to them. But you always can do a partial exchange. Yes.
Great. Yeah, just for people to understand, that's an option, to
Yep.
take,
That's
100,000 off the table and, the other 4 million have it go into the DST, it's good for people to know that that's possible.
And you can mix and match replacement property options too. I mean, this commonly occurs. Going back to that question you asked, Jeff, about the minimum investment amount, and what that allows for is multiple DSTs to be in one's replacement property portfolio, but you also can include an exchange into, say, a single family rental that eventually is going to be your primary residence
Yeah,
or a family vacation home for a portion of the proceeds. And then a portion of the proceeds could go into traditional DSTs, and a portion of the proceeds could go into 721 UPREIT DSTs, and you could even choose to pay tax on a portion of the proceeds. So creating these blended portfolios is very much on the table, and it all comes down to an exchanger's overall objectives and then how to tailor that portfolio and the exchange strategy to address those objectives.
awesome. Well, Austin, I really appreciate you and the expertise that you bring. And I always love seeing those Ansel Adams pictures behind you. I love Ansel Adams. But anyway, it's always good to see you, and hopefully we'll see you at the free AOA $1 million trade show in
Excellent.
August.
Likewise, Jeff. Always a pleasure to share. Thank you for the opportunity.
Great. All right. Thank you everybody for joining, and